I worked my whole life in industrial kitchens, dreaming of a peaceful retirement, a little rest after decades of hard labor. But fate had other plans. In my old age, I found myself working as a maid for my own daughter-in-law's family. I bent my back cooking washing dishes, watering plants, even scrubbing their clothes by hand. Yet it was through that very toil that I uncovered a shocking secret, one so painful it kept me awake for many nights. Stay with me until the end of this video to hear the full story, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from, my dear audience. And please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video to support me. When I look back, I sometimes wonder how everything began to fall apart. My name is Audrey Grant, 67 years old, once the head cook at a public high school in Cleveland, Ohio. For more than 30 years, I woke before dawn, tied my apron, and made sure every student had a warm meal before the first bell rang. People at work used to call me Miss Audrey with the golden hands. I never thought of it as talent. I just believed that feeding others was a quiet way to show love. After my husband passed away, the house felt like a hollow shell. The laughter, the clinking of plates, the smell of his coffee, all of it disappeared. I kept myself busy to avoid hearing the silence. I clipped coupons, watched my spending, and put every spare dollar into a small savings account. My pension was modest, but I was proud of what I had built with honest hands. Then came the day Julian called. His voice trembled, and I knew something was wrong even before he said the words. He had borrowed money to start a small tech business, but the venture collapsed. He owed more than $80,000, and the creditors were closing in. I remember staring at the faded wallpaper while he cried over the phone. My first thought wasn't anger. It was fear. Fear of watching my son drown in a sea of debt. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked around the house, touching the furniture we had bought together, the pictures of his childhood on the wall. By morning, I had made up my mind. I sold the house, the only place that carried my husband's scent, and handed Julian the check. He tried to refuse, but I pressed it into his hand. I told him, "You'll rebuild, and that's all I need to know." Deep down, I knew I might never have another home like that. But a mother's heart doesn't measure loss the way others do. I believed that if I didn't save my son from debt, my heart would never rest. Even now, I tell myself I did what any mother would do. But sometimes when the night grows quiet and the wind passes through my rented apartment, I can still hear the echo of that empty house calling my name. When Julian told me I should move in with him and Claire, he said it was for my comfort. He worried about me living alone, or so he claimed. I wanted to believe him. After selling my house and giving him everything I had, nowhere else to go anyway. So I packed my few belongings, the photo of my late husband, and the old recipe notebook I'd carried for decades, and took the bus to Columbus. Their two-story house stood in a quiet suburban neighborhood, freshly painted with a bright porch swing that looked inviting from the outside. Inside, it felt colder than I expected. Claire greeted me with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. She pointed out where I'd sleep, a small room near the laundry area, barely large enough for a bed and a dresser. I told myself it was only temporary, just until Julian's business stabilized and I could maybe rent a small apartment again. Julian was often away on business trips, sometimes weeks at a time. When he was home, he was exhausted, glued to his laptop or phone, apologizing quickly before rushing off again. That left me and Claire under the same roof most of the time. At first, she spoke kindly, thanking me for cooking or folding laundry. But soon, the tone shifted. She started leaving notes on the fridge with reminders. "Please vacuum before noon. Don't use too much detergent, dinner at 6. I followed them quietly, telling myself that helping around the house was the least I could do. Weeks turned into months. Claire began referring to me as Julian's mom instead of mom. When her friends came over, she would lower her voice and introduce me like a housekeeper. She helps us with meals, she said once, smiling as if it were nothing. I stood there holding a tray of cookies, pretending not to hear. The small room I slept in smelled of detergent and damp towels, and I missed the scent of cinnamon rolls from my own kitchen. I kept cooking, cleaning, ironing Julian's shirts, convincing myself I was being useful. But sometimes, when I looked out the window at the neatly trimmed lawns of other families, I realized I wasn't living. I was existing in a borrowed space. Claire Whitman was 35, polished, confident, and always ready to remind people that she had built her career from nothing. She managed a chain of bookstores around Columbus and liked to call herself independent and modern. To others, she appeared charming, even graceful, but I soon learned that charm was her favorite disguise. Around Julian, she played the role of the perfect wife, always smiling, touching his arm, calling me Mom Audrey in that syrupy voice that made me uneasy. But the moment he left for work or a business trip, the sweetness melted away like sugar in hot water. One morning, I was folding laundry when she walked in and said sharply, "Don't touch my clothes. If you ruin them, who's going to pay for it?" Her tone stung more than the words. I stood there holding one of Julian's shirts, unsure whether to apologize or defend myself. In the end, I just nodded. She turned away, muttering about how people never respect other people's boundaries. From that day on, I stopped touching anything that wasn't mine. But the list of not mine things grew longer every week. The dishes she bought, the towels, even the teapot I once used without asking. Claire liked to compare people, especially me and her mother. "My mom is 60 and still goes to the spa every weekend," she said once while scrolling through her phone. "She knows how to enjoy life. She doesn't sit around chopping vegetables all day." I smiled faintly, pretending to agree, though my hands trembled slightly over the cutting board. She had no idea that cooking was the one thing keeping me sane, the only way I could still feel useful. Sometimes I tried to think kindly, telling myself that she was just tired, overworked, misunderstood. But then I'd see how her expression softened when Julian came home, how easily she laughed and leaned into his shoulder, and I realized she could control her tone perfectly when she wanted to. The change wasn't stress, it was choice. And knowing that made the hurt worse. Still, I kept quiet. It's what mothers do. We endure hoping that silence can keep the peace. But inside me, a quiet ache began to spread, like a wound no one could see. Leo and Ella were the light of my days. Leo was 8, curious and full of questions, while Ella, just 6, followed him everywhere with her wild curls and endless giggles. They called me Grandma Audrey in their soft musical voices, and every time I heard it, a warmth spread through my chest that no amount of loneliness could dim. In the afternoons, when the sun began to dip behind the maple trees, we would sneak into the backyard with a small watering can and a box of seeds. Together, we planted tomatoes and lavender, and I told them stories about my old kitchen in Cleveland, how I used to make spaghetti sauce that simmered all Sunday, or how the students lined up for my cinnamon rolls every winter morning. Leo liked to pretend he was the chef, giving orders in a serious tone, while Ella stirred the soil with her tiny hands, humming some tune she had made up. Watching them, I felt like I had found a piece of myself again. I would kneel beside them, the scent of lavender mixing with the faint sweetness of cookies baking inside, and I thought maybe this is what peace feels like. But peace never lasted long in that house. Claire's voice would soon cut through the laughter from the patio door. "Leo, Ella, get inside this instant. Don't play in the dirt. You'll ruin your clothes. Mom, you're letting them get spoiled again." Her words always had that sharp edge that made the air freeze. The children would look at me with wide eyes, torn between obedience and wanting to stay. I forced a small smile and said gently, "It's all right, darlings. Just wash your hands before dinner. They always obeyed, though slowly glancing back at me as if afraid I'd disappear once they left. After the door closed, I stayed behind, brushing soil off my knees, staring at the small plants we had just watered. The laughter was gone, replaced by the faint hum of the dishwasher from inside. I told myself Claire meant well, that she wanted her children to be clean, proper, maybe better than how she grew up. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was an intruder in my own son's home, a guest with no place to sit unless invited. The rules started small. Claire wrote them on sticky notes, neat and pastel-colored, and placed them on the refrigerator as if she were running an office instead of a home. Dinner at 6 sharp, one said. Fridge shelves labeled, "Please keep your items on the bottom row," said another. Then came the unspoken rules I was allowed to cook, but only when she wasn't home and only the dishes she approved. I told myself it wasn't worth arguing over. After all, it was her house, or at least that was what she liked to remind me. One evening, I baked a small batch of cookies after dinner. Leo and Ella loved them warm with milk before bed, and I missed seeing them smile. I placed the rest in a sealed container and left it neatly on the counter. The next morning, I found the container open and the cookies dumped in the trash. Claire stood nearby, arms folded, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut glass. "Please don't leave cold food in my kitchen," she said. "I don't like clutter." I wanted to tell her they weren't clutter, they were memories, little pieces of comfort I still knew how to give. But the words stuck in my throat. I just nodded, picked up the empty container, and washed it in silence. That afternoon, I called Julian. I tried to sound casual as I mentioned what happened. He sighed, distracted as always. "Mom, please don't take it personally," he said softly. "Claire's been under pressure at work. You know how she gets when she's stressed." I bit my lip, wanting to say that kindness shouldn't depend on mood, but I only answered, "I understand." When we hung up, the quiet felt heavier than before. That night, I sat on the porch, the air cool against my face. The neighborhood was peaceful, glowing faintly under the streetlights. From where I sat, I could see the light still on in Claire's room upstairs. I wondered if she ever thought about how this house existed, because I had sold mine, how the walls, the furniture, even the roof had been bought from the pieces of my old life. Yet now I was just a guest here, one careful step away from being in the way. I wrapped my shawl tighter, staring at the faint light flickering in her window, and whispered to myself, maybe some homes aren't meant for mothers anymore. Every morning I woke before the sun, 5 o'clock sharp, the way I'd done for years. The kitchen was my quiet space, the one place where love still felt simple. I cracked the eggs, whisked the batter, squeezed fresh oranges. Pancakes, scrambled eggs, bacon, a little butter, the same breakfast that used to make everyone smile. It was my way of saying I care even when words had become scarce. But lately that warmth never reached the table. The sound of Claire's heels echoed down the stairs before she even appeared, a sharp rhythm that always made my stomach tighten. She walked in, glanced at the plates, and sighed. "It's too salty," she said flatly. "Older people shouldn't cook like it's the 1980s. Her tone wasn't cruel in volume, it was cruel in precision. Every word chosen to slice, not shout. "Leo." My grandson shifted in his chair, eyes glued to his phone. "Ella." My granddaughter looked up briefly, then back down at her cereal. No one defended me, no one even tried. I smiled faintly, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'm sorry," I said softly, wiping my hands on the apron. "I'll be more careful next time." But Claire was already turning away, pulling out her phone. "Don't bother. I'll just order healthy food for everyone." "Saves you the trouble." The words landed heavier than they sounded. That morning, for the first time, I didn't sit with them. I poured myself a cup of tea and carried it to the corner by the window, my new seat. I pretended to admire the garden, but what I was really doing was learning how to disappear quietly. From that day on, I stopped cooking for the family. Instead, I cooked small breakfasts just for the kids, 2 pancakes shaped like hearts, a cup of milk with a drop of honey. I'd watch them eat quickly before school, and then when the house grew still again, I'd wash the dishes alone. It's strange how disrespect doesn't shout. It seeps in one morning at a time until silence becomes your only language. And though no one said it out loud, I could feel it. A wall was being built, invisible but solid. They had their table, I had my corner, and the space between us, once filled with laughter, now echoed with the quiet sound of dignity breaking. It was one of those rare weekends when Julian called while not rushing between flights or meetings. His voice came through the speaker warm but tired, asking how everyone was doing. I told him I was fine, though my back ached from scrubbing the kitchen floor that morning. I didn't mean to complain, but he caught the fatigue in my tone. "Mom," he said softly, "maybe I should hire someone to help you around the house. You've done enough. You deserve to rest." For a brief moment, I felt something gentle bloom inside me. A bit of the old tenderness from when he was a boy, who used to worry if I skipped lunch. But before I could answer, Claire spoke from across the room. She laughed lightly, the kind of laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, please," she said, "you think we can afford that now? We're still paying off your last business debt. Besides, older people need to stay active. It keeps them sharp." Her words landed like tiny thorns. Julian went quiet. I could almost hear him pressing his hand against his forehead, the way he always did when caught between us. I rushed to ease the tension. "It's all right, sweetheart," I said quickly. "Your wife's right. Doing chores keeps me busy. I don't want to sit around all day." My voice sounded steady, but my heart wasn't. There was a sting beneath the calm, the kind that comes when someone denies you the right to rest, even after a lifetime of giving. Julian mumbled something about calling back later. I could tell he wanted to say more but didn't know how. When the line went, dead silence filled the living room. Claire picked up her tablet and scrolled through it as if nothing had happened. I stood there for a moment, unsure whether to leave or speak, then quietly folded the dish towel and walked to my room. That night I sat by the window, the house dark except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. I watched the porch light flicker and thought about how strange life had become, that I, who once sold my home to save my son, now had to prove that I still had the right to clean his floors. The words started as whispers, then sharpened into something that cut deep. Claire no longer bothered to hide her frustration. One evening after dinner, she slammed a drawer shut and turned toward Julian, her voice cold and heavy. "You failed at your startup and your mother spends her days cooking. Neither of you is any help to me." The sound of her words hung in the air like smoke. Julian didn't look up. He stared at the floor, his hands clasped together, saying nothing. I felt my heart twist in 2 directions at once, one for him, my son who had lost his confidence, and one for myself, realizing how easily I had become part of her anger. After that night, the atmosphere in the house changed. Claire took charge of everything, groceries, bills, even the thermostat. She began checking the receipts, making remarks like, "This brand of milk is too expensive," or "We don't need 2 loaves of bread." Then she quietly canceled my access to the joint debit card. "It's simpler this way," she explained flatly. "Everyone should manage their own expenses." I smiled weakly and nodded, pretending to agree, though my chest felt tight. I began buying ingredients with my small pension, careful not to let her notice when I tucked extra fruit or milk into the cart for Leo and Ella. Julian avoided confrontation. Whenever Claire raised her voice, he'd walk out to the backyard claiming he needed fresh air. Sometimes he'd call me later to apologize for her behavior, but his voice always sounded smaller than before. "Just give her time," he'd say. "She's under pressure." I always answered, "Of course, son," even though I stopped believing it. One afternoon, while helping Ella with her homework, I gently suggested that children shouldn't spend too much time on tablets. Claire overheard and snapped. "Please don't bring your outdated ideas into my parenting." Her tone was ice-polite enough not to sound cruel, but sharp enough to draw blood. That was the moment I understood completely. I wasn't family here. I was tolerated a guest with no right to speak, someone allowed to stay only as long as I stayed invisible. That morning, the washing machine stopped working. The lights flickered once, then went completely dark. I tried to check the plug, then the settings, but nothing happened. Claire appeared behind me, her voice sharp and cold. "Don't touch it. You'll just make it worse." I stepped back, embarrassed, wiping my wet hands on my apron. She bent down, briefly pressed a few buttons, and when it didn't respond, she sighed loudly, as if my presence alone had caused the problem. Days passed, then weeks. The laundry piled up in baskets, spilling out into the hallway. I waited for her to call a repairman, but she didn't. When I finally asked gently if we could get someone to take a look, she didn't even glance up from her laptop. "No need," she said curtly. "You're home all day, aren't you? Wash them by hand. It's good exercise for your circulation." That afternoon, I filled a plastic tub with cold water and carried it to the back porch. My fingers stiffened as soon as they touched the icy water. I knelt beside the tub, scrubbing shirts and jeans, the skin on my hands turning red and raw. Inside, I could hear the faint clacking of Claire's keyboard. Occasionally, her voice floated out through the half-open window. "Be careful not to get water on the floor," she said without looking up. "It stains the wood." I bit my lip to keep from crying. The scent of detergent and cold air mixed around me until I could barely tell if the water on my face came from the tub or from my own tears. Then Leo appeared at the doorway, clutching his toy car, his eyes wide. "Mommy, why is Grandma washing clothes by hand?" His small voice cracked something inside me. Before I could speak, Claire's tones snapped through the air. "Quiet, Leo. She likes it. It's good for her health." The boy's lower lip trembled. He turned to me confused, and I tried to smile, but it came out broken. "It's fine, sweetheart," I whispered. "Grandma's just helping." When he ran off, I went back to scrubbing my arms, trembling. I looked through the window at Claire sitting comfortably on the sofa with her laptop glowing on her knees, her expression calm, as if nothing around her was cruel. That was the moment I realized something had truly broken, not the washing machine, but the part of this home that was supposed to hold warmth. That night my back ached so much that even breathing felt heavy. I sat on the edge of the old armchair in the corner, the only place in this house that still felt remotely mine. My eyes fell on the washing machine, that silent, useless box that had sat dead for weeks. It had become more than an appliance. It was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong here: the coldness, the distance, the quiet cruelty, wrapped in polite words. I stared at it for a long time, feeling the ache in my back merge with something deeper, something I hadn't dared to name: exhaustion of the soul. The house was unusually quiet, except for Claire's voice floating down the hallway. She was on the phone, her tone soft and playful, so different from the one she used with me or Julian. "Don't call too late," she whispered, laughing lightly. "My mother-in-law's still here." Her words faded, followed by silence, then another quiet giggle. Something in her voice made my skin prickle. It wasn't just flirtation, it was secrecy. I sat completely still, afraid to move, afraid that if I did, I would break something inside me. For a moment, I tried to convince myself I'd heard wrong. Maybe it was a work call, maybe a joke. But deep down, something told me the truth was darker. My hands trembled as I reached for the blanket on my lap, gripping it tightly. I had lived long enough to recognize the tone of a woman who hid things I had once been one myself, keeping little secrets from my husband to protect his pride. But this was different. This was deception, deliberate and practiced. I closed my eyes and listened to the rhythm of her footsteps moving through the house. She spoke softly again, her voice dipping a sound of intimacy that didn't belong here. My stomach turned. I didn't hate her then, not yet. I only felt a chill like the one that comes before a storm. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dim light of the living room, my mind turning slowly, quietly. For months, I had tried to be patient, to believe that kindness could soften cruelty. But as I looked around the house that had once been bought with the sacrifice of my own home, I realized patience was no longer a virtue, it was a cage. Something inside me shifted, subtle but irreversible. My silence would no longer be surrender. It would be preparation. It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind that used to bring peace, but now only carried a heavy stillness. The laundry room smelled faintly of detergent and damp cotton. Clothes were piled so high they nearly reached my knees. Mostly Claire's dresses, her designer jeans and blouses that still carried the scent of her perfume. I filled the plastic tub with water, the cold biting into my skin, and began scrubbing one garment at a time, trying not to think too much. When I reached for a pair of her jeans, I felt something thick inside one of the pockets. I turned it over, expecting a receipt or some tissue. But as I pulled the fabric open, a small silver foil packet slipped out and landed at my feet, a condom brand new, still sealed. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I just stared at it, unable to move. Then as I bent to pick it up, a few receipts tumbled out too. Elegant cream-colored papers from restaurants downtown. Names I recognized from billboards and advertisements, the kind of places where dinner for two costs more than my monthly groceries. A chill ran through me. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the receipts. Dates. 2 weeks ago? 3. I traced the printed numbers, my mind struggling to catch up with what my heart already knew. Julian had been in Singapore for more than a year. He couldn't have been here. He couldn't have been the one sitting at those candlelit tables. The laundry room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. I sat down on the stool, the water sloshing at my feet, and pressed my palm to my chest. My heart was pounding loud enough that it seemed to echo off the walls. I wanted to tell myself it was a misunderstanding. Maybe she bought it for a friend. Maybe those receipts weren't hers. But lies no longer came easy to me. I had lived too long, seen too much. Slowly, I wrapped the packet and receipts in a small towel and slipped them into the pocket of my coat. My reflection in the washing machine's metal door looked strange, calm, but no longer naive. The woman staring back at me had reached a line she couldn't ignore. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was proof. Or maybe worse, a warning that the world around her was about to change forever. After that morning in the laundry room, I began to notice things I hadn't seen before. Or maybe I had, but refused to admit. Claire changed. The shift was slow at first, like the quiet turning of a season. Her makeup grew heavier, her lipstick darker, her dresses tighter and shorter. The scent she wore changed too, no longer the mild vanilla she used to favor, but something bolder, sharp, and expensive. A perfume that lingered long after she left the room. She started leaving the house more often, usually in the late afternoon, always with the same rehearsed explanations. "I have to cover an evening shift," she would say, while checking her reflection in the mirror. Or sometimes, "There's a publishing event downtown. Networking, you know how it is." I would nod, pretending not to notice the extra layer of perfume, the way she checked her phone and smiled before slipping it into her purse. When she came home, it was never quietly. The front door would click open near midnight, followed by the sound of her heels across the floor and her cheerful humming. She always looked radiant, cheeks, flushed eyes sparkling, the faint smell of wine mixed with that unfamiliar cologne clinging to her hair. She'd toss her bag onto the couch and murmur, "Long night." I'll shower, then disappear upstairs before anyone could ask questions. Leo and Ella had grown used to her absences. They would eat dinner with me at the table, while Claire's note sat beside the salt shaker. Order something through the app. Don't wait up. The children never complained, but sometimes Ella would ask softly, "Grandma, why doesn't Mommy eat with us anymore?" I never knew what to say. I'd just smile, cut their chicken into smaller pieces, and tell them their mother was working hard. But the truth was, I could see the cracks widening each day. Even the house started to change. Dust gathered on the bookshelves. The laundry stayed unfolded. The flowers on the windowsill wilted, forgotten. The air inside felt different, colder, emptier, as if the home itself knew it was being abandoned piece by piece. I watched it happen in silence, folding laundry that wasn't mine, washing dishes she no longer cared to clean. It was painful witnessing the slow unraveling of a family while pretending not to. Yet beneath that stillness, something inside me was waking. Not anger, not yet, but the beginning of resolve. That evening, I was folding laundry in the living room. The television was on muted, showing a cooking show I wasn't really watching. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. Then I heard Claire's voice coming from the kitchen, low at first, then softer still, like someone trying not to be overheard. I almost ignored it until I caught the words that made my breath stop. "Hi, Mason. I miss you. You always know what to say. Talking to you feels so much easier than with my husband." The fabric slipped from my hands. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my ears. For a moment, I couldn't move. I stood there frozen, staring at the folded towels on my lap. The sound of her laugh floated into the room, that light, playful laugh I hadn't heard in months. My fingers trembled, and the towel I was holding fell to the floor. I wanted to tell myself I'd misheard, that maybe Mason was a coworker or an old friend. But the way she said his name, soft, intimate, full of warmth, left no room for doubt. I felt my throat tighten, a strange mix of disbelief and sorrow rising like smoke inside me. The woman who slept under the same roof as my son, who called me Mom Audrey in front of neighbors, was whispering love to another man in my kitchen. When she finally stepped out of the room, she nearly bumped into me. Her eyes flickered with surprise for half a second. Then she smiled, that practiced, careless smile. "Oh, Mom," she said, tucking her phone into her pocket, "you scared me." I forced myself to speak. "Were you talking to Julian?" Her lips curved just enough to suggest amusement. "No, a client from work. We're finalizing a deal." Then she walked past me, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air like a lie. I stood there long after she left, staring at the darkened kitchen. The air felt thick, pressing down on me. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing her voice again and again, that soft, deceitful tone that no longer belonged to my family. And one thought echoed through my mind, relentless and cruel. If I tell the truth, who will my son believe? The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The fear was still there, but it had changed shape. No longer the kind that paralyzes, but the kind that sharpens the mind. I brewed a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared out the window until the decision settled deep inside me. I needed the truth. Not gossip, not suspicion. The truth that could stand in daylight. I picked up my old phone and scrolled through the contacts until I found his name, Rick Dalton. Years ago, we'd worked together in the kitchen of a large school district. He had always been quick-witted, steady, the kind of man who noticed things others missed. After retiring, Rick became a licensed private investigator in Cleveland. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly a decade, but when I called, he answered on the second ring. "Rick, It's Audrey Grant, I said, trying to steady my voice. I need a favor. I don't want to do something foolish if I'm wrong. I just need the truth. He was quiet for a moment, then his tone softened. Audrey, you never call for no reason. Tell me what's going on. I explained everything carefully, fact by fact. The receipts, the perfume, the late nights, the voice on the phone. There was no anger in my words, only the weight of a woman who had seen too much and trusted too long. Rick listened without interruption. When I finished, he said, All right, I'll help, but we'll do this properly. Legal and clean. True to his word, he filed the necessary documents the same day. In Ohio, surveillance of public spaces and GPS tracking are lawful if the vehicle is owned by the person who authorizes it, and the car Claire drove was registered under Julian's name. Rick would collect photographic evidence discreetly, without intrusion or confrontation. You'll get the truth, he assured me, and no one will see it coming. That evening, I gathered what he needed, a recent photo of Claire, her work schedule from the bookstore, and a copy of the car's registration form. My hands trembled as I placed the papers into a neat envelope. For the first time in a long while, I felt something close to strength. This wasn't revenge. It was self-respect. The quiet resolve of a mother who had been underestimated one time too many. It took only a week for the truth to arrive, wrapped in a thick envelope stamped and sealed with quiet finality. Rick had been efficient, meticulous, as always. When I opened the package at my kitchen table, my hands trembled slightly, though my heart felt strangely calm, as if it had already known what it was about to see. Inside were photographs neatly arranged, each one a piece of a story I wished weren't real. The first picture showed Claire stepping out of a sleek black car, her hair loose, her smile wide, brighter than I had ever seen it at home. Beside her was Mason Blake, her boss, the manager of the bookstore chain, a man in his 40s with a polished suit and a grin that reeked of arrogance. In another photo, they were walking hand in hand through the lobby of a downtown hotel. And then came the one that made my chest tighten, the two of them sitting in his car, her head resting on his shoulder, their lips touching in a kiss so casual, it spoke of habit, not passion. There was also a printed receipt from the Lantern Room, one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, the same place Julian had once wanted to take Claire for their anniversary, but she'd told him it was too pretentious. Now her signature sat clearly at the bottom of a bill for two dated 3 nights ago. I studied each image, each line of text, without blinking. The longer I looked, the more silent I became. There were no tears, no screams, no shattered plates, like in the dramas people watch on television. Just a dull ache spreading through my chest, heavy but controlled. I wasn't surprised, not really. Somewhere deep inside, I had already grieved this marriage before seeing the proof. What hurt was not the betrayal itself, but the calmness with which she lived it, laughing radiant alive while under this same roof, my son slept miles away, trusting her. Rick's message was short. All evidence obtained legally. Your call now, Audrey. I placed the photos back into the envelope and stared out the window. The sky outside was gray, the kind that promised rain. My reflection in the glass looked older, but also sharper. Thank you, Rick, I whispered. Now I know what I must do. No anger burned in me, only a cold clarity, the kind that comes when grief settles and reason takes its place. It was time to act, not as a victim, but as a mother, who finally understood that compassion without limits invites cruelty. All night I sat alone in my room, the curtains half drawn, the faint glow from the streetlight flickering across the table. In front of me lay the photos Rick had sent spread out in a careful line, like pieces of a broken life. Each one was a small knife slicing through what was left of my trust. But instead of crying, I found myself reaching for a notebook. My hands were steady now, I numbered every photo, wrote down the dates and times printed on the back, and matched them with receipts, messages, and the GPS records Rick had included. Slowly, methodically, I built a timeline, not of heartbreak, but of facts. The handwriting on the page looked firm, almost clinical, as if I were someone else, not a grieving mother, but an investigator. I stopped once to make tea, then went back to work cross-checking every detail. By dawn, my desk was covered with papers, each labeled and clipped neatly together. I realized something then. Julian wouldn't believe tears. He'd been raised on reason, on logic. He'd look at emotion and see exaggeration. If I wanted him to see the truth, I needed to show him evidence clean, legal, undeniable. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about clarity, about pulling him out of a lie before it destroyed him. As the morning light seeped through the blinds, I picked up the phone and dialed Rick's number. He answered quickly, his voice still thick with sleep. "Audrey." "Everything all right?" I took a breath. "Rick, I need you to go further," I said. "Not just the affair. I want to know if she's been using Julian's money. Bank statements, transfers, anything suspicious. If she's stealing from him, I want proof." There was a pause on the line, then a quiet sigh. "You sure you want to see all that?" he asked gently. "Yes," I replied, my voice firm. "If I'm going to protect my son, I can't close my eyes anymore." When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: control. The hurt was still there, burning softly under my ribs. But now it had direction. Pain without action is just suffering. Pain with purpose becomes power. And for the first time in months, I wasn't just surviving. I was preparing. A few days later, Claire's tone toward me softened the kind of sweetness that always made me wary. She knocked gently on my door one afternoon, her voice syrupy and careful. "Mom," she said, stepping halfway into the room, "I'm thinking of buying a new refrigerator. Ours is old and noisy. But my credit card limit is maxed out this month. Could you lend me a little? Just until next payday." I looked up from my notebook where I'd been jotting down small reminders from Rick's last report. Her eyes were bright. Her smile warm, too warm. It was the same look she gave Julian when she wanted something expensive. I closed the notebook slowly and said, "How much do you need, dear?" "Not much," she replied quickly. "Maybe $1,500. I'll pay you back as soon as my salary clears." $1,500? For a refrigerator that supposedly replaced a perfectly working one. My instincts stirred. I had spent decades reading people's motives in small gestures, the way they avoided eye contact, the way their voices rose at the end of a lie. I smiled gently and said, "That's fine. Just give me the store's details, and I'll transfer the money directly to them. That way it's quicker." The change on her face was instant. A flicker of hesitation, then a quick, dismissive laugh. "Oh, no need for that, Mom," she said lightly. "It's just easier if I handle it myself. I'll figure something out." And just like that, she left the room, her voice trailing off down the hall. I watched the door close and exhaled slowly. The refrigerator I suspected would never be bought. Later that evening, Rick called. His tone was cautious, almost reluctant. "Audrey." He said I ran a surface check on Claire's recent spending patterns. Since last month, there have been multiple luxury purchases under her name, designer handbags, high-end dresses, and several payments to boutique stores, all charged to Julian's account. He paused before continuing. "There's also a gift receipt made out to Mason Blake." I felt a cold wave rise from the pit of my stomach. A gift I repeated quietly, more to myself than to him. "She's bold enough to use my son's money for her lover." Rick's voice softened. "You did well not to transfer anything. She's testing boundaries. Now we have another layer of proof." I thanked him, hung up, and sat in silence. Outside, the streetlights glowed against the darkness, steady and indifferent. Inside, I realized something deeper. Betrayal wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it came dressed in charm, asking for $1,500 and smiling sweetly while it lied. It was a Thursday afternoon, one of those gray Ohio days when the clouds looked heavy enough to crush the rooftops. Leo's piano class was supposed to end at 5, and by 5:30 I was already glancing out the window, expecting to see his small figure running up the driveway. But the street stayed empty, the rain started to fall, and unease began to creep into my chest. By 6, I called the music school, Mrs. Grant. The teacher said, her voice hesitant, "Leo's still here earlier, but no one came to pick him up. He said his mom was supposed to." My heart dropped. I grabbed my coat, the old wool one I kept by the door, and ran out into the rain. The wind was sharp, the kind that made your breath sting. I drove as far as I could toward the school, then spotted him, a small, shivering shape, walking along the sidewalk, clutching his backpack to his chest. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his sneakers soaked through. "Leo," I shouted, pulling over and rushing toward him. He turned, his lips trembling, and when he saw me, he burst into tears. I wrapped my arms around him, feeling how cold he was, his body shaking against mine. "Oh, sweetheart," I whispered. "You're safe now. Grandma's here." By the time we reached home, both of us were drenched. Claire wasn't there. No message, no call. I changed Leo's clothes, wrapped him in a blanket, and set him by the heater with a warm cup of milk. His cheeks were pale, his small hands icy. I found some fever medicine and coaxed him to take it, brushing the wet strands of hair from his forehead. Tears fell before I realized they were mine. "Did you text your mom, honey?" I asked softly. He nodded weakly, unlocking his phone. On the screen glowed a single unread message. "Mommy, I'm cold. I've been waiting a long time." The timestamp was from nearly an hour earlier. No reply. I stared at those words until they blurred. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the heater and Leo's small coughs. I tucked the blanket tighter around him, kissed his damp hair, and felt something inside me freeze solid. It wasn't just anger. It was the realization that neglect could wound more deeply than cruelty, and that no child should have to beg for warmth in their own family. The next morning, the air in the house felt different, quiet, but sharp, like the calm before a storm. I had already made up my mind. When Rick arrived, I greeted him at the door with a folder in my hands and a calmness that came from somewhere beyond exhaustion. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd once shared breakfast with Claire and the children, back when this house still felt like a home. Inside the folder was everything I had recorded over the past month. Handwritten notes with dates and times of when Claire left the house, copies of questionable receipts, and several still images from the garage security camera. I had written every detail carefully, never guessing I'd one day need to use my own observations as evidence. Rick studied the pages silently. When he looked up, his expression was serious, but not surprised. "Audrey," he said, "this is thorough. If we move forward, you'll need to sign as a witness. It's not about accusing, it's about documenting. If your son ever decides to file for divorce, this evidence will stand." I nodded slowly. "I don't want to ruin anyone," I said. "I just want the truth to have weight." He placed the legal documents before me, explaining that everything would be done within Ohio law. The surveillance footage covered only the driveway and garage areas legally considered public access, not private space. There was no hidden camera in bedrooms or personal rooms, no intrusion into anyone's privacy. Just facts recorded clearly beyond denial. I signed the forms carefully, my handwriting firm, my heart steady. Rick slipped the documents into his case, then handed me a small USB drive. "This is your personal copy," he said. "Keep it safe. Don't mention it to anyone until the time is right." After he left, I stood for a while in the middle of the kitchen, holding that small drive in my palm. It was light, just a piece of plastic and metal, but it felt heavier than gold. I opened the old tea tin on the counter, the one Claire always mocked as grandma clutter, and placed the USB inside, under the loose sachets of chamomile. It looked harmless, ordinary, invisible. I closed the lid, pressing it shut. Around me, the kitchen was quiet again, filled with the faint smell of lavender soap. That tiny drive wasn't revenge, it was insurance, a silent weapon resting right in the heart of the house where I'd once been, made to feel powerless. It was late when Claire came home that night. The door creaked open, and the smell of alcohol drifted into the hallway before she did. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair slightly messy, and her voice slurred as she kicked off her heels by the door. "I'm tired," she muttered, not even looking at me. "Don't make noise." I simply nodded, my hands still resting on the teacup I'd been holding. There was nothing left to say. Words had lost their meaning in this house long ago. When her footsteps faded upstairs and the house finally settled into silence, I went to my room. The glow of the small desk lamp cast a warm circle over the old wooden table where my laptop sat waiting. I powered it on, the familiar hum filling the still air. My reflection appeared faintly on the screen. Tired eyes, silver hair, a calm face, hiding the storm within. I opened the folder labeled "For Julian" and reviewed everything. One last time. Photographs. Security footage, transaction records, Rick's written report. Each file represented a truth I had never wanted to know, but now had no choice but to show. My fingers hovered over the trackpad for a moment, before selecting them all and compressing them into a single zip file. Then I opened my email. In the subject line, I typed, slowly, carefully. My son read this carefully. "Do not be angry. Be clear-minded." For a long time, I sat there, the cursor blinking in the message window like a heartbeat. What could I possibly say that wouldn't destroy him yet would set him free? Finally, I wrote only a few lines. "Julian, I'm sorry you have to see this, but truth is kinder than blindness. I've gathered everything you need. Make your decisions not with rage, but with reason. Whatever happens next, remember you are not alone." I attached the zip file and pressed send. The sound of the whoosh from the email felt final, like a door closing. The clock on the wall ticked softly toward midnight. When the digital numbers switched to 0000, I whispered into the quiet room, "It's time, Julian. You deserve to know everything." The laptop screen glowed against the darkness, reflecting in my eyes. It was not just light, it was resolve. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a mother rewriting justice in her own way, not with shouting, not with vengeance, but with truth delivered in silence. Julian opened his mother's email late at night in his hotel room in Singapore. The subject line. My son read this carefully. "Do not be angry, be clear-minded," gave him pause. He hesitated for several seconds before double-clicking the attached zip file. What appeared on his screen froze him in place. Photographs, videos, receipts, a full investigation report. Every line, every image, every number told the same story. Betrayal, deliberate and cruel. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen as the weight of realization settled over him. His throat felt dry. The hotel air conditioning hummed steadily, indifferent to the storm building inside him. Claire's laugh echoed in his memory, that same easy laugh he once thought was love. Now it felt hollow, rehearsed. He closed his eyes, took a long breath, and for the first time in years, he didn't know what to feel: anger, sadness, or disbelief. Julian didn't call his mother. There were no words that could fit between them now, not until he saw the truth with his own eyes. Instead, he opened a new browser tab, booked the earliest flight to Ohio, and packed a single bag. During the long flight home, he couldn't sleep. The cabin lights dimmed, Passengers around him drifted off, but he sat still, watching the short video clip his mother had included Claire and Mason in the parking lot of a hotel, their hands intertwined, their faces close, in a way no explanation could justify. Each replay burned a little deeper. When the plane landed, the morning sky over Ohio was pale and heavy with mist. Julian rented a car at the airport and drove in silence, his mind replaying the timeline his mother had created, the dinners, the receipts, the missing hours. None of it could be denied anymore. By the time he reached Columbus, his pulse had steadied not from calmness, but from resolve. He didn't go home, not yet. Instead, he drove straight to the bookstore where Claire worked. The parking lot was half empty, the air damp from the previous night's rain. He parked across the street, lowered the window slightly, and waited. Through the glass storefront, he saw her perfectly dressed, perfectly poised, the woman he had built a life around. Then as the sun dipped behind the buildings, he saw Mason Blake walk out from the side door. Claire followed seconds later. She laughed that same carefree laugh he hadn't heard in months and reached out, her fingers curling tightly around Mason's wrist. They walked side by side toward his car, her head tilted, her smile radiant. But it wasn't the smile of a wife anymore. It was the smile of a stranger. Julian stayed in the car, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The truth wasn't in the documents or the photos anymore. It was right there, breathing before him, undeniable. Julian parked a short distance from the hotel, his heart steady, in a way that frightened even him. The world outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every sound sharper, every movement deliberate. He waited until he saw them emerge through the glass doors, Claire and Mason walking close, her hand brushing his arm with practiced ease. They laughed softly, unaware of the eyes watching from the shadows of a nearby car. Julian lifted his phone and pressed record. The camera caught everything, the way Claire leaned into Mason, the way his hand rested on her lower back as they walked toward the parking lot. They stopped by Mason's car, looked around briefly, then kissed, not a stolen moment, but the kind born of familiarity. Julian's fingers tightened around the phone, but he didn't move. Not a word, not a sound. He simply kept filming until they got into the car together and drove away. When the video ended, he sat still, the glow of the screen reflecting off his face. He replayed it once, just to make sure it was clear, no blurred edges, no doubts. The evidence was solid, indisputable, and filmed entirely in public. It would hold in any court, but more importantly, it held in his heart. The illusion was gone. He opened a message window and typed slowly, "Mom, you were right, but I need to face her myself." He attached the video and pressed send. A few minutes later, her reply came short and steady, like her voice had always been. "You don't need to shout. Just let the truth speak." Julian read the message twice. There was no anger in her words, only the calm of someone who had already seen too much pain to waste any more on fury. He put down his phone, exhaled, and closed his eyes for a moment. The ache in his chest didn't burn anymore. It had turned cold, precise, like the edge of a blade. That night, he drove home in silence. The roads were wet, reflecting the city lights like cracks in glass. When he stepped into the house, the smell of lavender detergent lingered faintly, his mother's presence still everywhere. He went straight to his room, pulled out a small USB drive from his pocket, and placed it on the desk. Inside, it was the same file copied from his phone: proof, truth, finality. His eyes were calm, too. Calm, the kind of calm that comes before a storm. The kind that doesn't need to raise its voice to change everything. Claire was lounging on the couch when the front door opened. The soft hum of the television filled the living room, and the glow from the screen painted her face in warm gold tones. She swirled a glass of red wine in her hand, glancing lazily toward the doorway. When she saw Julian standing there, suitcase in hand, her eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Julian, you're home," she said, her voice sweet but slightly off balance. "You should have told me you were coming. I would have cleaned up, maybe cooked something nice." She let out a small laugh, one that didn't reach her eyes. Julian closed the door quietly behind him. He didn't return her smile. His expression was calm, too calm. "You don't need to," he said softly. "I just have something to show you." He walked past her straight to the television and plugged a small USB drive into the side port. The screen flickered for a moment before the video started playing. At first, the room was filled with the sound of city traffic horns, voices, footsteps. Then the image came into focus. Claire in her red dress, stepping out of a car beside Mason Blake. They were laughing, holding hands, the night reflected in the hotel's glass doors as they walked inside together. Her voice echoed faintly from the recording light, and carefree. Claire froze. The wine glass slipped from her fingers and hit the carpet, spilling dark stains like blood across the beige rug. Her face went pale. "Julian, it's not what you think," she stammered, taking a step forward. "Mason, he forced me. He's my boss. I didn't." Julian turned to her slowly. His eyes were steady, emotionless. "He forced you." He repeated, his tone even almost quiet. "He forced you to wear that red dress, to choose that hotel, to pay for dinner with my credit card." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The only sound was the faint hum of the video still playing behind them, showing Claire and Mason disappearing into the hotel lobby. She opened her mouth again, but no words came out. Julian didn't shout. He didn't move toward her. He simply stood there, the weight of the truth pressing between them like a wall. "I didn't need a detective to see it anymore," he said quietly. "I just needed to look." The TV screen went dark. The living room was still filled only with the scent of spilled wine and the sound of a woman realizing that lies once exposed to light can never return to shadow. I stood behind the half-closed door, my fingers gripping the wooden frame so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I could hear every word from the living room, the sharp crack of tension in the air, the uneven rhythm of breathing between them. I didn't move. I didn't want to step in. This wasn't about winning. I only wanted my son to see. To finally see the truth I had carried in silence for too long. Through the narrow gap, I saw Claire's face under the harsh light. Her shoulders trembled. Her eyes darted from Julian to the floor. The stain from the spilled wine had dried into a dark patch on the carpet, a quiet witness between them. Then her voice cut through the room, shrill and desperate. "She set me up!" she screamed, pointing toward where I stood, hidden. "Your mother hates me. She's wanted this all along." I closed my eyes, taking in her words like cold rain on bare skin. I didn't answer. There was no point. I didn't need to defend myself. The truth was already speaking louder than either of us. Julian didn't even glance at the door. His voice was calm, too calm when he answered her. "You're lying again, Claire." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and laid it on the coffee table. "This is my credit card statement," he said. 8 dinners. The Lantern Room, the Harbor Club. 2 hotel stays same month. Mason Blake's signature on one of them. You used my card. My name. My trust. Don't you dare blame anyone else." The sound of the paper hitting the table was louder than her scream. Claire's face went white. Her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for oxygen. The strength she always carried, the arrogance, the sharp tongue vanished. For the first time, she looked small. Julian stepped back like the sight of her burned him. "I gave you everything," he said softly, "and you turned it into a lie." I pressed my forehead to the doorframe, my breath unsteady. Watching him stand there so calm and broken at once tore at something deep inside me. I didn't feel triumph, only a heavy ache, the kind that settles deep in your bones, when truth finally does its cruel work. This is what justice looks like. I thought not a victory, but a collapse. Inside, Claire's sobs filled the silence. Julian didn't move. The paper still lay on the table, a thin line dividing what used to be a marriage. I wiped at the corner of my eyes and took a slow step back. My part was done. The truth no longer belonged to me. It belonged to my son now. Julian's voice was calm, so calm that it frightened me. He stood in the middle of the living room, the faint light from the lamp outlining his face in shadows. "I'm not going to make a scene," he said quietly, almost gently. "But from this moment on, we're done. I've already sent everything to my lawyer." His tone carried no anger, no tremor, only finality. Claire's body stiffened. She took a few steps forward, her eyes wide with panic. "Julian, please," she whispered, reaching for his arm. "Do it for the kids. They need both of us. Don't do this because of your mother." He pulled his arm away, not harshly, but with the certainty of someone who had already let go. "No, Claire," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "Because of the kids, I can't live a lie anymore." The room went still. I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock, the sound of rain starting to fall outside. My hands were trembling as I stepped forward from behind the door. Both of them turned. Claire's eyes widened in disbelief. Julian's remained steady calm. I walked to the table and placed the small USB drive in front of her. It made a soft clink against the wood. "I never wanted to hurt you," I said softly, my voice almost breaking. "But you don't deserve to be their mother." For a moment, Claire just stood there frozen. Then her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The sound was raw, echoing off the walls, not the tears of guilt, but of a person realizing they had finally lost everything. Julian didn't move toward her. He stood still, hands clenched at his sides, the weight of his decision hanging heavy in the air. I stood beside him silent. We didn't need to speak. Words felt too small, too shallow for what had already been said. The rain outside grew louder, beating softly against the windows. Claire's cries faded into broken murmurs. I looked at my son, the man he had become, standing tall yet wounded, and I felt both pride and grief. Justice. I realized rarely feels triumphant. It feels quiet, heavy, and terribly human. The truth had done its work. There was nothing left to add. 2 days after the confrontation at my house, the storm that had been brewing finally broke, just not where anyone expected. That morning at the bookstore where Claire worked, everything began like any other day. Customers browsed quietly, the scent of coffee from the cafe corner lingered in the air, and Mason Blake, the regional manager, was doing his usual walkthrough, pretending to be the picture of professionalism. Then the glass doors opened, and silence fell. Linda Blake Mason's wife walked in. Everyone knew who she was. Elegant, successful, the kind of woman whose presence could still a room without saying a word. She was dressed in a cream-colored suit, her posture straight, her face calm. But her eyes held the kind of cold composure that made even the air hesitate. She walked right up to the counter where Claire stood frozen behind the register. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Linda placed a thick brown envelope on the counter. Her voice was steady, slow, deliberate. "This," she said, tapping the envelope lightly, "is proof. You have disgraced not just my marriage, Mason, but the name of the Blake family." The entire store went silent. You could hear the hum of the ceiling fan. Claire's face drained of color, her lips trembling. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. Mason took a step forward, reaching for Linda's arm. "Linda, please," he murmured, "not here." She turned to him with a look that could have stopped time. "No, exactly here," she said. where you pretended to work late while destroying everything we built together." Her voice never rose, but it cut through the room sharper than any scream could. Claire's hands shook. Her manager badge slipped from her blouse and clattered onto the floor. Mason's jaw clenched, his attempt to stay composed, faltering. Somewhere near the back of the store, a phone camera blinked red. One of the younger employees had started recording, unable to resist capturing the scene that would soon be the talk of the company. Linda turned and walked out without another word. Mason followed her halfway to the door before realizing she wouldn't stop. Claire stood motionless, her eyes wide, staring at the envelope still lying on the counter. Within hours, the video spread through the company's internal network. The title appeared beneath the footage, almost poetic in its cruelty, "When Silence Exposes Betrayal." And just like that, the world began to turn against her, not with rage, but with the quiet, unstoppable weight of karma. The fall came faster than anyone expected. 2 days after the scene at the bookstore, Mason and Claire were summoned to an emergency meeting with the company's board of directors. The email arrived with a single subject line: "Mandatory ethics review. Immediate attendance required." By noon, the news had already spread through the corporate offices like wildfire. The meeting lasted less than 20 minutes. When they walked out, both Mason and Claire looked pale, their faces stripped of the confidence they once wore like armor. The official statement went out the same afternoon, short, cold, and final, effective immediately. Mason Blake and Claire Whitman have been terminated for severe violations of the company's code of professional ethics. Inside the office, whispers filled the hallways. Those who once laughed at Claire's jokes now avoided her eyes. The same employees who used to praise her sense of style and ambition now changed the topic when her name came up. Her carefully built image, the confident manager, the modern working woman, had shattered overnight. Even her social media pages turned quiet as old friends quietly removed her from group chats and company networks. Mason fared no better. Within hours, his professional reputation crumbled. Clients withdrew contracts. The company's PR department released a press statement confirming his suspension pending ethical misconduct. And then came the final blow. Linda Blake, his wife, filed for divorce. The court documents listed infidelity, resulting in reputational and financial damages to the Blake business group. Linda demanded compensation, not just for emotional distress, but for the measurable loss to the family's brand image. It wasn't revenge. It was precision. A calculated surgical strike that stripped Mason of the wealth and power he had built through her connections. Claire, meanwhile, found herself without a paycheck, a husband, or an ally. The HR department escorted her out with a cardboard box of belongings. Her designer handbags and heels looked almost absurd against the gray of the corporate parking lot. She tried calling Mason, but his number was disconnected. For the first time in years, she was truly alone. That same evening, Julian received a call from an attorney, an acquaintance of Linda's. Mr. Grant, the lawyer, said, "If you're considering filing for divorce, your mother's documentation is airtight. Photos, statements, timestamps, all admissible in court under Ohio law. You have more than enough to protect yourself." Julian said nothing for a long moment. He simply looked out the window of his office, watching the gray clouds drift over Ohio. Justice had begun its quiet work, not through anger, but through consequence. It was raining hard that evening, the kind of relentless Ohio rain that turned the streets into rivers and the air into mist. I was sitting by the window with a cup of tea when I heard it, 3 hesitant knocks on the front door, followed by a trembling voice. "Mom, please, it's me." I opened the door, and there she was, Claire. Her hair was drenched, clinging to her face, and her coat hung heavy with rain. Her eyes were swollen, rimmed red, the mascara washed away by tears and water alike. She looked nothing like the woman who once walked through this same doorway in expensive heels, chin high with pride. "Mom, She stammered between sobs. "I was wrong. I've lost everything. Please forgive me." I stood there for a moment, the sound of rain filling the silence between us. I could smell the damp air on her coat, see the trembling in her hands. Part of me, the part that had known her cruelty, her deceit, wanted to close the door. But another part, the mother in me, remembered that she was still the mother of my grandchildren. My voice was calm when I spoke. "Claire, I said this door has always been open for those who know how to live with decency. But lies, no matter how heavy the rain, can never be washed clean." She broke then. The strength in her legs gave way, and she sank to her knees on the wet porch, crying like a child. Her sobs mixed with the sound of thunder in the distance. I didn't move to comfort her. Mercy without honesty is just pity, and pity can't rebuild what she destroyed. Behind me, I heard Julian's footsteps. He walked into the hallway, silent at first, then set a folder down on the table beside me. His voice was low, almost kind, but unyielding. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he said. "But we're not a family anymore." Claire looked up at him, eyes wide, desperate. "Julian, please, for the children," she whispered. He didn't answer. The sound of her tears was the only reply. I turned away, then my chest tight. Upstairs, Leo and Ella were in their room, the soft hum of a lullaby playing from the little speaker by their beds. I had made sure of that they wouldn't see their mother like this. No child should carry the memory of a parent's shame. When I closed the door again, the storm outside still raged, but inside there was only silence, the kind that comes when justice is done and there's nothing left to say. When the divorce was finalized, there was no shouting, no fight left in anyone, just the cold stillness of signatures on paper. I was there when Claire came to hand over the last of her belongings. Her face was thin, pale, almost unrecognizable. She stood quietly in the living room, eyes wandering over the photographs on the wall, pictures of Leo and Ella from happier times. When Julian asked about custody, she shook her head. Her voice was steady, almost too calm. "I'm not fit to raise them," she said softly. "Let them live in peace. They deserve that much." No one replied. There was nothing to add. Sometimes remorse speaks best in silence. That night, I saw her for the last time. She loaded the trunk of her old sedan with boxes, her movements slow and heavy. Before driving away, she left a folded piece of paper on the porch. No apology, no excuses. Just a few plain lines written in her small, careful handwriting. "Thank you, Audrey, for raising them with real love." Something I couldn't give. The porch light flickered as she stepped into the darkness. I didn't follow. I just stood there, the paper trembling in my hand, and thought of how arrogance always carries its own price, not in money but in loneliness. As for Mason Blake, his fall was swift and merciless. News broke that the parent company had permanently banned him from working in any management position. His name, once printed in glossy magazines as a rising business leader, was now whispered only as a cautionary tale. The man who once believed he could have everything power, reputation, indulgence was left with nothing but silence. Weeks later, word reached us that Claire had left Ohio. She'd gone south to a small town in Kentucky, where she found work at a tiny independent bookstore. A friend of mine sent me a photo, Claire behind the counter, hair tied back, wearing a simple sweater. There was no glamour, no perfume, no diamond ring, just quiet. I sometimes wondered if she found peace there, stacking books, serving coffee, spending nights alone in a rented apartment above the shop. Maybe she did. Or maybe that silence was her sentence, a slow echo of everything she'd lost. Pride had built her world, and pride had destroyed it. A few months passed, and spring finally returned to Ohio. The garden outside my house was alive again, the lavender blooming in soft purple rose, the tomato vines stretching toward the sun. The air smelled of earth and promise. Leo and Ella ran barefoot through the grass, their laughter spilling into the morning air like a song I hadn't heard in years. Watching them, I realized how easily children forget the storms once the sky clears. They no longer remembered the cold nights or the shouting. To them, there was only sunlight and the certainty that their grandmother was always there. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, the steam curling up into the cool air. My hands, once tired and trembling, felt steady again. I had learned that peace doesn't come from revenge, but from reclaiming your own dignity. The world had turned, justice had found its place, and life quietly, stubbornly had begun to bloom again. Julian joined me carrying 2 mugs. He looked older somehow, not by years, but by wisdom. He sat beside me in silence for a while, watching the children chase a butterfly across the yard. Then he said softly, "Mom, I understand now. No one has the right to demand submission from another person. Not in marriage, not in life." I turned to look at him. The sunlight touched his face, and for the first time in months, there was no anger in his eyes, only calm. I smiled faintly. "You've grown, Julian," I said. "Sometimes people need to break before they can see clearly." He nodded, eyes glistening. "You were right about Claire. But more than that, you were right about strength. It isn't about fighting back. It's about knowing when to walk away with your head high." The wind stirred the lavender blossoms, carrying their scent across the porch. I thought of everything that had happened, the lies, the tears, the long nights of doubt, and realized they had all led to this, a quiet morning filled with light and laughter. When Ella ran up to me clutching a small daisy, I bent down as she placed it in my hand. "For you, Grandma," she said proudly. I kissed her forehead, smiling. "Thank you, sweetheart. It's beautiful." As the sun rose higher, the garden shimmered with color. It wasn't just a new day, it was a beginning. The kind of morning that feels like forgiveness. Justice for the elderly begins the moment they stop being afraid of being looked down upon. It was a quiet spring morning when I sat in my garden, the air still cool and sweet, with the scent of lavender and freshly turned soil. The sunlight filtered through the trees in gentle patches, and Leo and Ella were beside me, their laughter echoing as they watered the flowers with tiny hands that still trembled from excitement. I watched them with a kind of peace I hadn't known in years, the kind that comes only after surviving every storm and realizing you're still standing. Julian stepped out from the house carrying a small tray with tea for us both. His face looked softer now, lighter. He sat beside me without saying anything for a moment, just watching the children chase each other around the flower beds. Then his voice broke the silence. "Mom," he said quietly, "I'm sorry. For everything. For making you carry so much alone." I turned to him and smiled. "Don't apologize, son," I said softly. "Some wounds aren't meant to destroy us. They're meant to wake us up." He looked at me for a long while, as though those words carried something he had been searching for. Then he nodded, eyes shining, and reached for my hand. I could feel the warmth of his palm, steady, grateful. The past had left its marks on us, yes, but not bitterness. Only wisdom. The garden shimmered under the morning sun. I could hear the gentle hum of bees, the rustle of the wind, brushing against the lavender blooms. For the first time, I didn't feel old. I felt grounded, like a tree that had weathered too many winters to ever fear another. I glanced toward the children again. Ella was laughing so hard she fell into the grass, and Leo was trying to help her up, both of them covered in dirt and joy. That sight, messy, real, alive, was my reward. Not revenge, not pride, just peace. When people ask me what justice means, I tell them it's not about punishment. It's about reclaiming your voice, about refusing to be silenced even when the world tries to make you small. And to those who've been through what I have, mothers, grandmothers, women, who've given everything and been made to feel invisible, I say, Tell your story. Share it. Because when we speak, we remind others that dignity doesn't fade with age. It only grows stronger in silence that refuses to break.